Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of Just Another College Football Podcast. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Wednesday, March 12th, and we have a great show. We're going to get into spring practice. This is going to be the big topic of today's show. It is getting going around all of the country right about now, and definitely want to break that down for you guys. And we might as well jump on in. No time to waste. Let's go ahead and jump into the spring practice preview, and a lot of different things are going to be going on over the next couple of months and really into next year as we get an idea of what the new world of college football looks like. Obviously, a lot of new things changing in terms of the revenue structure, in terms of the player payment. All of those things are going to be changing over the next little bit, and then you're also going to have to keep up with all the teams and how they're looking going into next year, because there's quite a few teams that are staring down a massive spring practice, and we'll get into a couple of those here in a second. But let's go ahead and jump into here, and first let's talk about the storylines that we're going to be looking at as we get into these next couple of months. Revenue sharing is going to be a big time one. We've already seen a couple of different headlines out there of teams just trying to find money wherever they can. I know A&M signed a huge 15-year deal with Playfly Sports that will absolutely help out some of those things that are going to have to become due, because as we all understand by this point, $20.5 million is what every school around the country has to play around with when it comes to revenue sharing from those TV deals. And the question is, how do you break that up by sport, and then how do you break that up within the sport of college football? It's a big kind of a debate right about now. Now, Title IX is something we've talked about in the past, and I've written about a little bit on my blog, but the reality is this is not going to apply. Title IX will not apply to revenue sharing. It is going to be split as the athletic department sees fit. So, as you can imagine, a lot of that will be going to the college football programs all around the country. A lot of that number will be going to the quarterback one and maybe even the edge rusher one, depending on what team you're talking about. So, there's a lot of different things that are going to be happening over the next little bit with this. I know there's different hearings happening over there in Washington, D.C. right now. Obviously, that will take a little bit longer term than I think a lot of us would hope, but hopefully there will be at least a little bit better of idea how all this is going to work. The reality is we probably won't really know the effects of this, how all this is going to break down, until it unfolds. Until next year, we'll get a better idea of where all the money went, how it was spent, was it spent effectively, do teams need more money, is it creating a more balanced playing field like Kalen DeBoer talked about at Alabama, or is it kind of hurting the sport in another direction, which is a real reality, because NIL is still a big time part of this conversation. So if you have $20.5 million and then a little bit extra to spend, which plenty of teams do, then you can go right back down to the NIL portal and just try to see if you can outbid teams that way. So going to be a really interesting thing to watch, both from a recruiting perspective, how do people approach this from an NIL comparative to the revenue sharing system, and then just how does it work once it's put into place in 2025 is going to be a really fascinating thing to watch. Another thing is going to be the spring game changes. You won't see as many spring games this year as you've seen pretty much every other year before this. Texas, Nebraska, USC, among some others, are not doing spring games at all. Ohio State, Ole Miss, who did this last year, are kind of doing untraditional spring games. So for Ole Miss, that's the Grove Bowl games. We've talked about that a little bit. Really enjoy that idea. I think it makes total sense. I think the reality of spring practice is the reality of all spring in general. You want to make sure the fans are involved in some way or another. So I'm hoping that Texas, Nebraska, USC, they give fans an open practice at the very least, or a signature session, whatever it is. Just give the fans a chance to go into DKR, to go into Memorial Stadium, to go into the Coliseum and be able to see these players, at least in the offseason, because a lot of us are already starving for football, and a lot of those fans want to be involved. Now, we'll still see plenty of spring games, and we'll get into that at the very end. We'll go through kind of the schedule of those spring games, but the reality is we're not going to see some of the bigger ones, and I think that Texas one was going to be very interesting for a lot of people. We'll have to wait a little bit to see Arch Manning in real action. Then you got coaching changes, and that guy is going to dominate a lot of the conversation. Bill Belichick going over to UNC, thought he was going to be on a Hard Knock style show. Didn't end up happening, and I think the reality was they probably accepted it, and then Bill Belichick heard about it and said, I am not doing that by any means. I'm not giving you all the access that you very much want if we're going to do this. So that is not going to happen anymore. We won't get that inside look, but we'll get plenty from UNC over the next little bit. I can promise you that. Don't know what that year is going to look like. We'll get into predictions a little bit later on, probably after spring if I'm being honest, but definitely a team that is going to get a lot of headlines. But then you have Scott Frost returning to UCF. You have Rich Rod returning to West Virginia, which very interesting story about TikTok happening around there. But at the end of the day, going going to be really interesting to watch those two guys. Dan Mullen's back in the game of college football over there in Las Vegas for UNLV, and tons of coordinator changes all across the country. Two up there in Columbus, Ohio, that they're going to have to replace some very, very talented play callers. So it's going to be interesting to see all this unfold. A lot of different coaches going all over the place, and we'll get some pretty early returns over the next couple of months. And then we got QB battles. And this is something we will get into in the next segment. I will give my pick for all of the big-time QB battles all around the country. The reality is you got Michigan, Alabama, Ohio State, and plenty more that are looking for their next signal caller. A couple of those feel like they have their guy pretty much set in stone, and we'll get into that in the next segment. But there's also a couple that are entirely up in the air. And I think this one right here, Alabama, is going to be huge. You got three different guys, as far as I'm concerned, that are competing for that spot. And you got to have Kalen DeBoer, who needs at least 9-10 wins, probably needs to go to the CFP if he doesn't want Alabama fans breathing down his neck for another 365 days down there in Tuscaloosa. But those are the storylines, the big-time storylines you're going to want to watch. Obviously, there will be a million other things. We'll get into the NFL draft talk. There's pro days going on, so plenty of stuff to talk about. We will get into a lot of that stuff next week and kind of going throughout spring, but let's get in some teams to watch. I only have 3 here. We'll continue to do this on my blog, go through a ton of different teams you're going to want to watch and reasons to watch them, but these 3 really stood out to me for kind of different reasons. But we'll start with the Texas Longhorns, and let's just be totally honest, it's because of that guy right there. Arch Manning is going to be a huge topic of conversation throughout this year. There's no doubt about that. But on top of that, the O-line is replacing 4 starters. You have Matthew Golden, Isaiah Bond, Gunnar Helm walking out the door. Quinn Ewers obviously walking out the door. The 3-year starter is not an easy guy to replace by any means, even if you do have a Manning waiting in the wings. But obviously, we won't quite get the spring game that we want, but there will be plenty of talk. I can promise you that. And it sounds like in that wide receiver room, a couple of guys are down for injury throughout spring. It sounds like Ryan Wingo is the only wide receiver in that room currently that's getting snaps throughout spring at the very least that has a catch in the college football world. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch. Guys like Aaron Butler is someone that I really like. That's going to be really fascinating. Dalen McCutcheon coming in as a freshman. Khalil Lockett, Jamie French as well. So it's going to be interesting to watch those guys develop. If Texas does dip into the portal for another wide receiver during spring, maybe it didn't go quite as smoothly as they were hoping to for those guys early on in their careers. Michigan's the other one. I think the reality is Michigan was on top of the mountaintop. They fell back down to 7-5, but got that win over Ohio State. And now you move forward in 2025, and it's a start of a new era more than anything else. I think you look at a guy like Bryce Underwood coming in, and we'll talk about him obviously in the next segment. But the reality is, with him coming in, you promised him $12 million. Everyone knows that. That is fully on the table. They know what the price tag is. You got to bounce back. And the reality is, when you look at that schedule, very navigable. There's not a lot of big-time matchups. Obviously, you have the Ohio State one, but no Penn State, no Oregon on that schedule. They're going to be able to navigate this pretty well. Now, you're losing guys like Will Johnson, Kenneth Grant, Mason Graham, and a ton of guys on the offensive side of the ball, including that running back duo. So there's plenty to replace, but bringing in guys like Justice Haynes, bringing in a couple of transfer wide receivers and a couple of guys on defense, I think they're going to be more than fine, but they got to bounce back in a big way. And the reality is, it's probably going to fall on number 18 to Bryce Underwood's shoulders, and if he can't answer the bell in spring, he's probably not answering the bell during fall either. And then Miami, and yes, that is a Georgia jersey there. Carson Beck is their new quarterback. The problem is, he is injured right now, so you got to figure out what you're going to do with him going forward and how quickly does he progress, because the earlier he can get throwing to these receivers, the better off that Miami's going to be in that first game against Notre Dame. So they're kicking off with a really, really huge one, and they need this guy ready to roll when he gets there. Sounds like he's changing his number to 11, so something to be on the eye out for. If you see number 11 on the practice field out there, see how he's moving. Just see how quickly he can get the ball out of his hands. As of right now, he's not throwing it all. We'll see how quickly he gets back on pace. But the other part is Emory Williams. You know, you have a guy that has a UCL injury in Carson Beck. You need that backup quarterback to take strides forward. Last year it was relatively ugly in a number of different places when he got on the field. That has to change very, very quickly. If it can't, then he's going to have a big-time problem on his hands. And Miami might just have a big-time problem on their hands, because if Carson Beck goes down again next year, do you feel confident about the guy right behind him? So they got to be really careful about this. It's going to be a very interesting thing to watch. We will not see Carson Beck a lot, or really at all, until the summertime, until really fall camp. he better be ready for fall camp, because if he's not ready then Miami's going to look a little bit out of sync in week one. They're going to fall to 0-1 a little bit faster than they would like to. So going to be an interesting thing to watch. Those three teams really stand out to me for a couple of different reasons. Obviously, Texas will get a lot of talk, and we will talk about them plenty. Miami will follow Carson Beck very closely among a lot of the other guys they've brought in, but the reality is those three teams need huge springs, and let's look into the schedule and when these teams might be gearing up to play their games. And April 5th is when it all really kind of gets underway. UCF, Clemson, West Virginia all getting underway, so we'll be able to see Scott Frost. We'll be able to see Rich Rod at their old universities, see what they can do back at the helm. And then, obviously, Clemson's going to be a fascinating watch. And one of those teams that I'm watching very closely as we go into the next year. I think the talent level is absolutely elite, a little bit closer to that national level that it was in 2016 and 2018. Will be really interesting to watch what they can do in that spring game. Then Ohio State, Alabama, Florida, Notre Dame, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Auburn, LSU, and Georgia, they're all on April 12th. As we all know, that's kind of the big week when everyone kind of gets it out of the way. A lot of the SEC teams find their way to that weekend, so will be fascinating to watch what Georgia does. You know, we talk about quarterback battles here in a second. I'm not going to include Georgia because I feel fairly confident that it's going to be Gunnar Stockton, but a guy like Ryan Puglisi is someone they really like down there. You have Ryan Montgomery coming in as a freshman. It'll be an interesting watch. There's no doubt about that. Tennessee will be really interesting to see what they're doing. Oklahoma with John Mateer. So April 12th, I will be absolutely glued to my TV trying to watch all these games and see what these guys have in them. And that Notre Dame team, another QB battle we'll talk about here in a second. Then you get to the next week, 18th and the 19th. You have South Carolina on the 18th on that Friday night. And then you got Michigan, Texas A&M, Colorado, and Texas Tech all on that 19th. And it's going to be a really interesting group. I think for Michigan, obviously Bryce Underwood's going to be the story. For A&M, I'd love to see what Marcel Reed has done over the offseason. Needs to take a big step forward passing the football, and we'll see if he can do that in that game. And then you got Colorado. That's always going to be a huge storyline, especially with Caden Salter coming in. Another QB battle that we'll talk about in the next segment. But overall, that's going to be a really fun day. Texas Tech is one of those teams that you just want to watch for a little bit closer this year because a lot of things are going right down there in Lubbock. And then Oregon and Penn State that following weekend on April 26th. Two great teams, two teams that very much want to win a national title. It'll be really interesting to see what Dante Moore has. It'll be fascinating to see if that Jim Knowles defense shows us much of anything on that day. And then Washington finishes out as they always do on May 2nd. Very late, right in the middle of that portal window, so it's always a little bit messy up there in Seattle once they get their spring game underway, but will be really interesting to watch a guy like Damon Williams Jr. go to work because one of my favorite quarterbacks as we head into 2025, one of those guys that you're just not going to want to miss. I can almost promise you that. So that's the reality of spring practice. As of right now, we got a couple of teams to watch. We got plenty of storylines to watch. Got to 4 right there, but plenty others, obviously. And then you got spring games coming all the way down the road throughout April into May. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be great to watch all of this. There will be plenty of overreactions to be had. I will do my best to not overreact. The reality is a lot of this is a zero-sum game. You don't know if the offensive line is great or the defensive line is not all that great or vice versa. So it'll be an interesting thing to watch. Don't put too much into spring practice, but definitely we'll have plenty to talk about in that. And the biggest thing is going to be the QB battles. And we got to talk about it right after this break. We got to get into Alabama, Michigan, Ohio State, and a ton of other teams that are just trying to find their signal caller. I'll give my pick for who I think they're going to be right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about kind of just a spring overview. There are a ton of different things to get to, and we'll get to that over the next couple of weeks. We'll definitely talk about different reports from spring ball, all these different stuff that will start unfolding in. The biggest thing that we're going to be watching is the QB battles. That's obviously going to be a big time topic of conversation over the next 2 months, 3 months, maybe even into fall camp for a couple of these, because there are some really interesting battles as we get into this. And let's go ahead and jump in, because there's a lot to get to. There are about 6 teams I have here. Frankly, I could have had a seventh, but I talked about it. I don't think Georgia is that much of a battle. I do think it'll be Gunnar Stockton in 2025. Ryan Puglisi will have something to say about that, and we can talk about that in time. Maybe it'll be a little bit more of a battle than I'm thinking of right now. But let's go ahead and start in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. Kalen DeBoer's got to get this one right, plain and simple. If he does not get this one right, they miss the CFP again, and Bama fans get really frustrated very quickly. I think they were okay with a 9-win season. I don't think they were super happy about it, but I think they understood that some things were getting in the way of this team being downright elite. There were some things that were just going to be tough this year, regardless of if it was Nick Saban or Kalen DeBoer. The reality is it was Kalen DeBoer, and it was a messy year. There's no doubt about that, at least in terms of Alabama standards. I think a lot of different teams would trade places with them in a second, but the reality is, as you go into next year, you have Ty Simpson, you have Austin Mack, you have Keelan Russell. Those are your three options. Ty Simpson, the most experienced of the group, at least at Alabama, has been the backup for a couple of years behind Jalen Milroe, and played some pretty good football when he got in there in some different spot starts. Obviously, not the greatest of competition that he was getting in against, but still a very talented kid, can throw the ball all over the yard. Austin Mack, a guy that came over with Kalen DeBoer from Washington to kind of be the third string backup kind of guy, and played at times last year, not a ton. Definitely a guy that has a big time upside, hasn't quite hit that upside that you would love to see if you're an Alabama fan. And then Keelan Russell comes in as one of the most talented freshmen in the entire country. I believe he ranks anywhere from 1 to 3 on any of the recruiting sites out there. Very, very talented kid, and someone that I think just about anyone in the country would love to have on their team. Alabama does, and it'll be really interesting to see what he can do throughout this spring. But as of right now, Ty Simpson will be your favorite. There's no doubt about that. He's going to be the guy that a lot of people are circling. I'm circling someone else. I'm going to pick Austin Mack to take this job. I think Austin Mack is the guy that gets the start to start the year. I think Keelan Russell could finish the year, and that's something we can unpack a little bit further on. Obviously, that would take Alabama losing a couple of games, so maybe things go a little bit sketchy for them. But Austin Mack is the only quarterback that Kalen DeBoer has recruited twice. He has found a way to get him to Washington the first time around, and then brought him over from Bama, and he didn't do it just to have him sit on the bench for multiple years. I really do think Austin Mack is a very, very talented player. Bringing in Ryan Grubb back is definitely a huge step up for him, because he understands the offense a little bit better than Ty Simpson or Keelan Russell will, with him being at Washington before this. So it'll be an interesting thing to watch. There's no doubt about that. I think Austin Mack wins this one. I think him and Ty Simpson are probably battling into fall camp, if I'm being totally honest. I don't think this one's remotely decided before fall camp, but I also think Keelan Russell is one of those guys that if they lose 1 or 2 games early in the year, let's say they're 4-2 in 6 games, or they're even 5-2 in 7 games, I do think we're going to be talking about Keelan Russell pretty quickly, and that kid is just otherworldly talented. So it's going to be rather hard to keep him off the field, and once you put him on the field, you're not getting him off. I can almost promise you that. Moving over to Michigan, another team that they got to get back on top. That is the ultimate goal of this season, and these are going to be the 2 guys that possibly bring them there. We'll start with Mikey Keene. He comes over from Fresno State, actually played Michigan last year, and very experienced, very confident quarterback. Has played 4 years already, walks in right as the savior of the program walks in, which is Bryce Underwood. He will steal the headlines, and the reality is, I think it's Underwood's job. I really don't think there's any other way that this can go, because again, everyone knows the price tag. Everyone knows that you paid $12 million to get this guy on campus. Everyone knows he's probably making somewhere in the ballpark of $3 million this year. He better be your starter, and he better be ready to roll. And the reality is, I have no worries about this kid. I think he will be the starter. I think he will play very good football for them. I think he will be more than fine. I'm not super worried about Bryce Underwood not hitting, if I'm being totally honest with you. That being said, there's a lot on this kid's shoulders, and if he does start, there's going to be a lot of people hoping that he is Superman right from the jump. I can't necessarily promise that, but a very, very talented kid. I just think it has to be his job more than anything else. I don't know if that's necessarily the right way to go about business, but the reality is, with that type of price tag, I think that's your starter, and I don't think there's much argument elsewhere. Moving over to their rivals, Ohio State, the team that they'd love to beat for a 6th year in a row. Wow, that's insane. But getting back to this, Ohio State has three guys that I think are contenders for this job: Julian Sayin, Lincoln Kineholtz, and Tavian St. Clair, another freshman that is coming in like Keelan Russell and Bryce Underwood. Very talented kid. Really remarkable, built like an NFL quarterback right about now. Really talented kid, and he will be the future of this program. I feel pretty confident in that. Don't think he's going to win the job this year. Now, he's going to be an interesting thing to watch. There's no doubt about that, because he could very easily be the backup going into next year, depending on how this spring goes. But I think the reality of this one, I'm not going to waste a lot of time. It's Julian Sayin's job. If it's not Julian Sayin's job, then something went very, very wrong throughout spring and summer and fall camp, that he is not the starting quarterback. Whether that's injury or him just not playing the football that they expected of him, it will be Julian Sayin. I feel fairly confident in that. He gets a little bit more back to that CJ Stroud, little, pocket passer type ability. Ball comes out of his hand like it's a slingshot. It's really, really fun to watch, and he's a very talented kid. I have very few doubts that he's going to be a very good player for them. Now, he's thrown into the fire with Texas right away, so it's going to be really interesting to see how he handles that, how quickly he can get his feet under him. But at the end of the day, incredibly talented kid, and I think those other two guys, while very talented, I think they're a step behind this one. And I think especially Lincoln Kineholtz, I think he might be fighting for the backup position more than he's fighting for the starting job throughout spring. Notre Dame, they have three guys on the board as well, and they have a very deep quarterback room going into next year. Really like what this group is built of, because I think you have Steve Angeli, the very veteran guy, the guy that understands the offense, that's going to make the right play, that's going to put the ball where it needs to go. Then you got CJ Carr, the very talented sophomore that you really love, definitely brings a little bit different ability to the offense, has a little bit bigger of an arm, is a little bit more of that pocket passer type guy. And then you got Kevin Minchie, a very talented kid that has kind of just been overlooked throughout this process. A really, really talented guy, and definitely someone that could just steal the show throughout this next little bit, give them a little bit different of an ability on offense, and maybe be the guy that steals the show here. I think Angeli is the safe bet here. I think everyone understands that he is the guy that understands this offense. He is the veteran of this group. He's the guy that a lot of the people in that locker room probably gravitate towards most easily. I just think CJ Carr is going to steal the show. I really do. I think CJ Carr is an absolute freak of nature. I think he is a guy that can throw the ball so comfortably from the pocket. I think he has a little bit more of the athletic ability that you don't get from Steve Angeli, although Steve Angeli can move, no doubt about that, but I think CJ Carr is your guy, and I think some of it might be you don't have the 2025 that you really want to have, you don't get right back to the national title, but you have a guy that's fully ready to go going into 2026. Now, that's a bargain, one way or the other. If you think Steve Angeli can get you to the CFP, possibly get you back in a chance to win a national title, then you throw him out there. But the way that I see it, I don't think Notre Dame's getting to a national title regardless. I'd play CJ Carr and just let him lead me the next couple of years. I think you'd be very, very happy with the results of that. He's an incredibly talented kid, and I think he's just one of those that he's going to get on the football field this spring, and it's going to be really hard to not give him the job by the end of it. Colorado, one of the teams that everyone loves talking about and everyone loves having an opinion on, one way or the other, very aggressive one way or the other it seems, but we have two guys that are very, very different quarterbacks and very interesting choices as we get into this spring camp for Colorado, Caden Salter and Julian Lewis, and two guys on two totally different spectrums when it comes to the way they play football and the time that they've played football. Caden Salter going into his fifth year in college football, played some good football at Liberty, definitely in 2023 was a downright incredible player, looked like he was going to be the big name on the market during the transfer portal, put his name in, dropped out, went back to Liberty, and didn't quite have the year that he wanted to have. Had some injury troubles and seemed like he had some injury troubles. I shouldn't say he definitely did. There was some talk about him having injury troubles. Nothing concrete. I'd be surprised if it wasn't, if I'm being totally honest with you. He turned over the ball a lot, did not bring that running ability that he really brought in 2023. I think it's going to be really, really tough for him to play that poorly again, frankly. I think Caden Salter is a very good player. I like Julian Lewis a lot. I think he's a very talented player. I think it's going to take him some time, and I think you're going to have to start Caden Salter to start this season. I do think it's a week-by-week proposition, though. I will say that. I think Caden Salter is a very talented player. I'd be very surprised if he was not the starter going into that Georgia Tech game to start the year for the Buffaloes, but at the end of the day, Julian Lewis is a very dangerous guy, and is a guy that if you can get him up to speed a little bit quicker than you're expecting, if you're sitting at 3-3 after 6 games or 3-4 after 7, I think a conversation will be had. I think Julian Lewis will take over at that point. I don't know if they'll get to that point. Hopefully they will be a really fun team and definitely have improved in a number of different places, but the reality is you're replacing one of the best quarterbacks in the country last year in Shedeur Sanders. I think you have two very talented guys. I don't know if you have one that's going to replace him entirely. So you better be able to run the ball a little bit more effectively. Yet another reason why I think Caden Salter has to be the choice here, because he makes that a little bit harder on the defense when you know the quarterback can run. There's a number of different things to kind of take into account here. The reality is I just don't think Julian Lewis will be there quite yet. I don't think he'll be ready to start right away, and I think Caden Salter will be. So I think he gets the start against Georgia Tech. Cannot promise he will get the start at the very end of the year, because Julian Lewis is a very talented, very dangerous player, and if it doesn't go according to plan in the first month and a half of the season, you could definitely see Julian Lewis a little bit earlier than I'm projecting right about now. And then we'll finish it off with Oregon. And this one kind of falls under the same category as Georgia with me. I don't know if there's much of a competition here. Now, I love Austin Novosad. I think he's a very talented player. Came in a year ago, one of those guys that you really love the tools. There's so many different things that he can do incredibly well. I think like Dante Moore last year, I think you just benefit from sitting 1 year and getting some of those spot reps in some different games that you're up a lot in, or it's all the way over, whatever it looks like. Just finding a way to get him on the field is going to be super beneficial, but at the end of the day, it's Dante Moore's job. Let's just be totally honest. This is Dante Moore's job to lose. He is the quarterback I might be most excited to see that is not named Arch Manning. I think all of us are very excited to see what Arch Manning can do, but Dante Moore, I cannot wait. He's a very, very talented thrower of the football. If he is half of what Tez Johnson was saying he was going to be, he's going to be a really special player, and he will be the starter for this team. Now, can he hit the ground running is going to be a really interesting conversation, but the arm talent is different in every sense of the word. Learning from a guy like Dylan Gabriel did him a ton of favors this past year, and the reality is, when you have a kid with that amount of talent, I don't think you keep him on the bench for more than 1 year. So I do think it will be Dante Moore's job, much like I think it's going to be Gunnar Stockton's over there in Athens. I don't think these are huge competitions. I think they're interesting things to watch, and maybe, Ryan Puglisi down there in Athens or Austin Novosad up there in Eugene will steal the show, but as I see it right now, maybe Akili Smith Jr., who knows, will steal the show up there in Eugene, but as of right now, I feel pretty safe saying that Dante Moore is going to be the guy you're going to be watching for the Oregon Ducks next year. But overall, these QB battles are going to be weird. There's no doubt about that. I think the two that I'm going to be watching probably most closely are the one in Tuscaloosa. That's the number one to me, because Kalen DeBoer's got to get it right. One way or another, he's got to find his guy, and whether it's Ty Simpson, Austin Mack, Keelan Russell, or maybe they go get a guy in spring portal, which is a dangerous proposition. There's no doubt about that. And then Notre Dame is going to be a fascinating one. In the title last year, you have Steve Angeli that's been there for so long, understands the offense, very, very professional player, and then CJ Carr, that upside player that's so much fun to watch, and then Kevin Minchie, a guy that a lot of people have written off by this point. I wouldn't write him off too quickly. Very, very talented, very athletic kid that I think could make some waves in this spring practice and maybe just steal that job for the Fighting Irish. But overall, those spring battles are going to be fascinating to watch, and we'll continue to update those. Maybe I'll update some picks as I get a little bit more information throughout the spring practices. But as of right now, that's what I got for my spring picks. I do think it's going to be Austin Mack over there in Tuscaloosa, as crazy as that might sound right now. Although I think a couple of these young guys like Keelan Russell, Bryce Underwood, and a couple others are going to make some waves here pretty quickly. But we'll talk about that in time, obviously update you throughout and see if any of the guys are taking huge leads or just a little bit of a lead in some of those QB battles. But let's take our break here. And when we come back, we got to go away from spring camp just for a little bit. We got to talk about the ACC. Florida State, Clemson, and the ACC have settled their suit, which means a lot of different things. And we got to get into all of the different things it means right after this, so stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about all of the quarterback battles going on around the country, even left out Georgia. So that's another one you can throw in there. I'm not super worried about Gunnar Stockton's position on that team. I think he will be the starting quarterback for them, but definitely something to watch. There's no doubt about that, and we will update you as we get throughout spring camp. Maybe someone just takes over this job that I'm not even circling right now. So we'll get into that in time, obviously, but we got to talk about something a little bit more mundane, but very, very important in the world of college football. Florida State, Clemson, and the ACC have put down their swords, at least for the time being. It sounds like they have gotten a settlement on the table for the ACC moving forward. It is going to keep Florida State and Clemson in the ACC for now, and we'll talk about that here in a second. But overall, there's a number of different things to kind of get from this. If anyone's confused about what I'm talking about, a while ago, probably about a year and a half ago, probably about this point, Florida State did sue the ACC. The argument was the ACC was not doing enough for their teams in terms of marketing them the way that they should, in terms of pushing the committee to be more give them more spots in the CFP. This obviously came after Florida State was left out for Alabama. They felt like the SEC did a better job of pitching Alabama than the ACC did of pitching Florida State. So they were very upset. They've wanted to leave the conference for a year and a half now. It's been a testy relationship. There's no doubt about that, and been very interesting. And can't imagine Jim Phillips loved handing the trophy over to Clemson this past year, but the reality is they have come to a little bit of a ceasefire, and it's a very interesting one. For Clemson, there's a number of different things to kind of take into account here. They're obviously a big-time program. There's no doubt about that, and it seems to be that they're slowly finding their way back into the reality of college football now, the new world of college football, and it'll be really interesting to see what they can do. And then for Florida State, they need life. There's no doubt about that. And it's going to happen in this football year, and we'll talk about Mike Norvell plenty throughout the next little bit. But this is obviously something that they very much needed, and definitely something that once they get to 2029 and 2030, it's definitely going to be a really interesting thing to watch. And we'll talk about all the different details of this, but the biggest thing is the revenue distribution. That is going to be the biggest difference that you're going to find over the next little bit in the ACC. Is they're going to divide the revenue just a little bit differently. The way it works right now, 100% of the revenue is split evenly among the 14 teams. Right now, Stanford and Cal are getting, I believe, 30% of whatever they are owed. SMU decided they were going to take no money for the first, I believe, 9 years of their contract. They are not going to take anything from that big time pool that everyone gets from, frankly, because they know they have plenty of money in the behind the scenes, but they will still not be included in that 40%. So that's still going to stay the same. Nothing's going to change about that 40%. Now, the other 60% of that revenue share will be split based on a ratings-based formula. So that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. It's going to be based on the last 5 years, so whoever got the most eyes is going to get the most money, and it could lead to some teams losing, I believe, about $7 million a year on the lower part of this conference, and some teams boosting up about $15 million a year in the top of the conference. So going to be really interesting to watch all of that unfold. This is a huge, huge piece of this. The kicker of this entire thing is, in addition to the total cost of, in addition to this change, the total cost of leaving the ACC will be dropping $18 million every single year through 2029, 2030. Then it drops to $75 million. So in 2031, that's when everything goes crazy. And the short and long of all of this, and if all of that kind of went over your head or was very confusing or just too many words, a little bit of a word salad there, the long and short of this is Clemson and Florida State won. They won this battle. There's no doubt about that. They found a way to get this win, and they found a way to just badger the ACC into getting what they want. And what they wanted was a clean path out of the ACC. However long that took, however long that looked like, and the ACC is just doing the best they can. I think the reality was the ACC was never going to come out of this not settling. They were going to have to settle at some point, because you can't fight with Clemson and Florida State if you're the ACC. Same way Alabama and Georgia. You're the SEC, you don't want to be fighting with those two teams. If you're, in the Big 12, you don't want to be fighting with Utah, and all those big-time programs. So this is just the reality of the situation. ACC wanted Clemson and Florida State to stay. They understood that them ruling with an iron fist was not going to do that. They found a way to settle, and it leaves the door open. But what it always also does is give more money to these two while they're here. So the question is, do they feel okay when they come to 2030? Are they fine with the amount of money they're making comparative to the other teams? And are they a little bit closer to those SEC teams and those Big Ten teams that they very badly want to compete with? That's going to be an interesting thing to watch, because the reality is, in 2031, it's going to be a whole lot easier to leave this conference. And it's going to be a whole lot easier for these two programs especially to find their way elsewhere. It's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. And then I think SMU is going to be a fascinating team to watch just in general because they're not a part of that 40%. They should be part of that 60%, and they're going to be relatively high in that number. How do you factor that in? Do you go back to their AAC days and see what that looks like? Because that's an entirely different ballgame in terms of TV deals and media deals comparative to the ACC. So that's going to be an interesting thing to watch. They should get a little bit of a boost, but how big is that boost? How do they go about that with those new programs in that conference? Because it's a different world for SMU now compared to in the American just a year ago. So that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch. But the big question is what everyone wants to know. What happens in 2031? What happens when all of this unfolds and we're down to $75 million to leave the conference and everything else happens? Let's just be totally honest. The answer is relatively clear. They're going to find their way to these two conferences. The SEC and the Big Ten are sitting relatively pat right now. They know they have all the power. They know they have all the ability to kind of go and do as they please over the next little bit, whether that's break off and start their own thing, whether that's get a couple of TV stations to back them, which is a real reality that we can talk about next week. But a couple of different things to kind of take into account as we get into where these teams could end up if they were to leave the ACC. I feel fairly confident that they will be leaving the ACC in 2031. But at the end of the day, where would they end up? It'd be one of these two conferences. For the Big Ten, the big thing to remember is you have to be an AAU school. And if you don't know what that means, basically it means you're a big-time research institution. You're a little bit more mirrored or geared towards academics than some other universities around the country. That's just kind of the reality of that. Not necessarily an overly intense thing, but something that the Big Ten has held relatively pat. Nebraska is not one, but they were one when they joined. They lost it a couple of years later. Big Ten was none too happy about that. So that's something to keep in mind. The teams that are AAU schools in the ACC are Miami, Duke, Georgia Tech, UNC, Virginia, Pitt, and Stanford. All very, very good teams, all teams that could be looked at by the Big Ten. I think the reality is you probably start with Miami and UNC. Those are the two-time, big-time brands that you very much want. Then I think you go to Georgia Tech. You have them in Atlanta. You have a big-time media market. I think the Big Ten would be very, very wanting Georgia Tech, but I think the other side would as well. And that's the other thing to keep in mind here. While the Big Ten does have those AAU requirements, the SEC does not. So it doesn't mean that they can't take anyone from AAU school. They absolutely can. So a team like Georgia Tech, where they used to be in the SEC, why not bring them on back, get that Atlanta market? You have Nashville already. Obviously, Atlanta would be a little bit of an upgrade from that. And then FSU and Clemson just feel like SEC teams. That's the reality of that situation. Neither of them are AAU schools. I'd be a little bit surprised if they went anywhere else. Now, I've heard Florida State going to the Big Ten. If the Big Ten is very, very serious about that AAU accommodation, that's not going to happen. Now, if they release those rules just a little bit, which that is very a reality that very well could happen, then I could see the Florida State finding their way up there. I think for Clemson, it's just a slam dunk. I think they're definitely an SEC school. I think bringing that rivalry between them and South Carolina in conference is going to be huge. And then for Florida State, bringing that Florida one in conference would be great for everyone else. I don't know if Florida wants that too much. And for Georgia and Georgia Tech, I don't know how that would go down. It would be a very interesting thing to watch, but as we saw when Texas tried to join, A&M was none too happy. I don't think Florida would be very happy with Florida State. I don't know if South Carolina would be super happy with Clemson joining. So that'll be an interesting thing to watch. The reality is these teams are probably going to find their way elsewhere. I think the ACC opened the door. I think they did the best they could, if I'm being totally honest. I think that deal is a way to keep these guys intact, a way to keep these guys in-house, and hopefully by 2030 keep them on the payroll, keep them in that group. But as of right now, it looks like 2031 is going to be the time. It sounds like the ACC has kind of started the clock on their own demise, and we'll see what happens over the next little bit. Maybe they can avoid it, but the reality is the ACC was always going to have to settle in this one, and I really do think they just started the clock on a lot of different things that are going to go really wrong for the ACC, but they got a little bit of time to figure some things out. I don't think anything will happen until 2030, 2031, and then you'll see some teams start to jump ship, and it'll probably start with these two. I don't know where they'll end up. Maybe Florida State and Clemson both to the SEC. Maybe they split ways. I don't know what happens. But at the end of the day, it's going to be the Big Ten and the SEC. It's going to be maybe a Super League that we can talk about next week with a lot of the different networks being involved in that. A lot of different things happening in college football right about now. As of right now, the ACC is concerned with staying alive for the time being that they can. they did that. And at the very least, they're going to live until 2031, and then I tend to believe a lot of things are going to go wrong pretty quickly, but we'll obviously keep our eye on that and see what happens once that does come. And at the very least, ACC can breathe here just for a second as we get into the craziness that is going to be the next couple of months. But overall, incredible to see that kind of off the plate of the ACC people, off the plate of Florida State and Clemson. It does kind of confirm that we're going to have another realignment storm here at some point, probably in the 2030, 2031, because that's when a lot of these media deals are up. And the reality is, right when that happens, I think the entirety of college football could change pretty quickly. And we can obviously get into that in time. The reality is, we got plenty of time to talk about that. But that'll do it for this edition of the for just another college football podcast. Getting a little bit lost here, but overall, the spring is happening all around us. It's going to be incredible to watch all of this unfold. The quarterback battles are going to be incredible to watch. Do be locked in on the blog. I'm going to continue to post my NFL draft rankings after the combine has happened. Continue to post spring content, some fun little superlatives as we head into next season. Just some different things over there on thomasbrzee.squarespace.com. If you want to check out all of that stuff, you are more than welcome to. Obviously, would love for you to like and subscribe here. Would mean the world to me. Definitely does help me out a lot, and want to keep bringing you guys this content as much as I can every single week. Wednesday will be the day going forward. This is the one that I wanted to kind of land on, officially have this week, and we'll continue down the road this week. So I will see you next week, and we'll talk about all of the craziness that I'm sure is going to unfold over this weekend, and we'll get into spring ball just a little bit more often next week. So thank you so much for listening, and I will see you guys next time.